Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. Cobus Van Staden, who's normally here with me today, is off on a very important assignment to open a bank account for us today. So we had to choose between the show or a bank account, so we had to choose the bank account. And our guest today has assured me that he's not taking any slight from that. Today we're going to be picking up the conversation that we started last week, looking at China in the Mideast after the U.S.-Israel-Iran war. Last week we spoke with Ahmed Abdou, who talked to us about the impact from the Gulf region. Ahmed is the China head at the Emirates Policy Center. Next week we're going to be looking at specifically Iran with William Figueroa, who's one of the top China-Iran scholars. And today we're going to focus specifically on Israel. And this is one of the most interesting dynamics in all of this, because the China-Israel relationship really went into a deep freeze after October 7th. China took very strident positions that many in Israel saw, and it was very easy to see, that were very much in opposition to what Israel was doing in Gaza and others. But in recent months, in the lead up to this war, we started to see some warming of ties and some easing. China started to soften some of its language. The Israelis were starting to put out signals that they wanted to get this relationship back on a track. We won't say on track because, well, it's really hard to determine what the track is, but it was really more getting the economic relationship going again, knowing that they were never really going to get their politics aligned in that sense. So let's get now a deep perspective on one of the top experts in the China-Israel space. Thrilled to have our old friend Gedaliah Afterman, who is the head of the Asia-Israel Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, and a lecturer at Reichman University and Tel Aviv University. Gedaliah, wonderful to have you back again.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be back on the podcast. Has been an eventful few weeks.
Yes, it has been. Let's start with that. Where are we today now that the ceasefire does appear to be holding? The Chinese have gone a little bit more quiet in recent days on this issue. We see in Chinese media, our friend Tuvia Gering, he's been posting quite a bit on X about how the Chinese are trying to, Chinese propaganda at least, is trying to shift some of the narrative. When you look at where we are today in the China-Israel relationship after October 7th, after the U.S.-Israel attack in Iran and also the Iranian attacks on Israel, where are we today? Let's start there.
So, let's take a step backwards. And we've talked before in this podcast about how China responded to the 7th of October attacks, the Hamas attacks, and how that created a rift or tension in the relationship. The response to the Iran war has been quite different. And I think it's important to understand that from a Chinese perspective, Iran is much more important than Gaza. Right? So if on the Gaza front, China became very negative towards Israel, very critical of the United States, in many ways I would say that China used the Gaza conflict as a stick to attack the United States. When it came to Iran, when it came to real interest, real Chinese interest in the region, China took a much more measured approach. So in the early stages of the conflict, when we weren't sure if there's going to be a war or Israel will attack or won't attack, I think the Chinese were very focused on trying to avoid an actual attack happening. Once Israel attacked, that was a new stage, and of course we had the third stage, which was the Americans coming into the war as well. I think generally speaking, the Chinese tried to be very balanced when it came to the war. They tried to, of course, they criticized Israel, but they tried to criticize both sides and basically call for calm. I think an interesting element that we've been hearing from Beijing is Beijing trying to position itself as a potential mediator in this conflict in one way or another. And like I said, I think China is very cautious. China is kind of waiting to see what happens, both in the sense that I think, let's put it this way, when the U.S., when Donald Trump decided to attack the Iranian nuclear sites, that was perhaps for a few hours there the worst possible outcome from a Chinese perspective. having not only Israel but also the U.S. come in and have a war in Iran, I think that was a very difficult or very concerning moment for Beijing. But once we moved into the ceasefire and the ceasefire is holding, Beijing is in a better position, and it possibly sees also some potential for cooperation. You've probably seen a lot of rumors online about arms sales from China to Iran. Looking to the future, you could see potentially China playing a role in negotiation and mediating between China and the U.S. or some kind of other role. So I think the Chinese are feeling calmer than they did a week ago, but they're playing it very cautiously.
Okay, well, let's take a listen now to what that sounds like in practice, what some of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing was. Let's take a listen to some sound from Fu Cong, who is the Chinese ambassador to the United Nations. And this was his remarks when the conflict just started going, and it emphasizes what Gedaliah was talking about in terms of how they proposed themselves as mediators, and they were trying to blame they laid a little bit more blame on the Israeli side, but also at the same time called for peace. Let's take a listen.
Israel's actions violate international law and the norms of international relations, jeopardize sovereignty and security of Iran, and undermine regional peace and stability. China unequivocally condemns this. Chinese President Xi Jinping has put forward a 4-point proposal regarding the current situation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has spoken separately with his counterparts of Iran, Israel, and the regional countries. At this critical juncture, the international community should further forge a consensus and make every effort to promote talks to ease tension.
So that was Chinese ambassador to the United Nations, Fu Cong, obviously speaking through an interpreter at the UN Security Council. And he mentioned the 4-point plan proposed by Xi Jinping. And Gedaliah, I'd like to get your take on it, because it didn't seem like that plan got any traction whatsoever, in part because these 4 points are A, non-starters in some part of Israel, but B, we've heard them many, many times before, and they've also received no traction. So point number 1, advancing the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of a new Palestinian state. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that is off the table as a point right there. An immediate end to Israeli settlement building and calling for an early resumption of peace talks. Hard to imagine the current Israeli government going with that. Coordinating international efforts to put forward, quote, peace-promoting measures that entail joint participation at an early date. No idea what that means. Finally, promoting peace through development and cooperation between the Palestinians and Israel. Gedaliah, these are milquetoast type of proposals that I don't get the sense were taken very seriously when Fu Cong spoke about these and when Xi Jinping unveiled them in places like Israel. Again, most of those are non-starters. What was the reaction in Israel to both the rhetoric coming out of Beijing and this 4-point proposal?
So you mentioned the criticism of Israel in the outset. I think no one was surprised in Israel to hear the Chinese position. In particular, the Chinese ambassador to the UN is the whip, right? He's the one that comes with the most critical, with the harshest criticism, and we've seen that over the last few years very clearly. In terms of Israel, in terms of China as a mediator between Israel and the Palestinians, as you said, this has been, these 4 and 5-point plans have been around for a long time, and they were never taken very seriously. They were always seen as some kind of a token, a lip service kind of an approach. I think maybe the only point that could be relevant for China, if it's serious about wanting to be a mediator, is this kind of economic cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians. And if you like to take it another step, I would say regional cooperation. I've been talking to some Chinese counterparts lately, and they've been pushing themselves as a mediator in the Middle East, right? How can China become a mediator in the Middle East? And one of the biggest problems is a gap trust, right? Especially after the 7th of October, Israel wouldn't accept China as a mediator because China is not seen as a fair player, right? As someone who could really mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. But I said, if you do really want to play a role, a positive, a constructive role with China, that's the line that China is selling at the moment, then regional economic cooperation that includes Israel and the Palestinians could be one direction. The question is, again, how serious is China about it?
And what's the view in Israel?
Not very serious.
Yeah, that's that's what I imagine. But Israel is very serious though about maintaining its economic relationship, or at least its trading relationship with Israel, particularly as Israel is facing more isolation from the international community, particularly from Muslim-majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Even Brazil has said its relations with Israel are very strained. So let's maybe move out of the diplomatic side of things into the economic side. And there is where it seemed like there was some daylight over the past 12 months leading up into the conflict with Iran. What about this economic relationship as a vector for improved Sino-Israeli ties?
So when it comes to the Sino-Israel-China relationships, I would say that these things are connected, right? The economics and the politics are connected to a degree. Throughout the war with Gaza, there have been a little bit of shifting, but generally speaking, the economic relationship has held. For example, if you're looking at electric vehicles and others, Israel is still very high on the list in terms of importing Chinese cars, etc. I think what did change a little bit is the sense in China that their somewhat one-sided approach to the war in Gaza hasn't really paid off, especially as Israel was seen to be victorious on the military front outside of Gaza, so in Lebanon, Syria, Iran. So I think that especially after the fall of the Assad regime, Beijing understood, or maybe people in Beijing started to think, that Israel can't be taken for granted. Israel has to be part of the Middle Eastern kind of strategy for China, and that means that we need to warm up the relationship again. When it comes to the Israeli-China relationship, that means the economic relationship, right? Because the political relationship is still very much strained, although we have seen some positive steps. For example, I think we've discussed this before, but in the Munich Security Conference, we had foreign ministers meet for the first time in 10 years, which is pretty remarkable. So we've seen some kind of symbolic political moves, and we've definitely seen attempts by the Chinese to warm things up a little bit, or at least defrost the relationship politically. Now, it's true that Israel does need Chinese support, especially when it comes to infrastructure, and that's something that hasn't changed. But on the other hand, you will have growing pressure from the United States in terms of the relationship with China. So Israel is still in a tricky position. I would say it's not so much up to Israel, but more to China-U.S. dynamics.
Well, talk to us about the port of Haifa, because that was always seen as having a kind of insurance policy, because Chinese state-owned companies operate a portion of the port of Haifa. And so there was always some sense that so long as the Chinese are operating the port of Haifa, they might have been able to tell the Iranians, don't target the port of Haifa because you're going to start impeding our interests. From my understanding, the port of Haifa was not spared in the attacks that occurred on Israel. And one has to think, will the Chinese be back in the rebuilding process of this port and be back as an operator if they do face American pressure, as you point out, to try and ice out the Chinese from being involved? Because this port of Haifa was a sticking point with the Americans, who didn't really like the fact that the Chinese were involved in the port of Haifa.
Right. So part of the strategic thinking in Israel used to be that if the Chinese have skin in the game, so to speak, in Israel, then they could perhaps convince the Iranian not to attack. As you said, in the recent round, we've had Iranian missiles hit infrastructure in Haifa, including trying to target the port itself. So that didn't really, that argument hasn't really worked. But in terms of Chinese involvement, the Chinese are still involved in the Haifa port. They just announced that they're selling, I think, 25% of their stake in the port, but they're still sticking around in that sense. So I think in that way, I don't think that Israel is seen as less important strategically for China. I think the fact that they're actually having to recalculate the view of the Middle East with a weaker Iran. So if you have a new Middle East, where you talked yesterday to our friends from the Gulf, so you have the Arab Gulf, you have Saudi and the UAE on the one hand, you have Iran and you have Israel. There's a bit of a shift at the moment in terms of the dynamic between those three elements in Chinese view of the Middle East. And China has to recalculate its position where Iran is A, much weaker, B, that sense of vacuum where Iran was an area of vacuum where the U.S. doesn't have a foothold might be changing. And if that's the case, what are the important elements in the Middle East for China? So I would say Saudi Arabia and the Gulf are number one, Iran is number two, and Israel has been sliding. Yeah, so in that sense, I think China is also having to rethink some of its Middle Eastern strategy.
And will Israel move up or down in this hierarchy in your assessment?
In the short term, I think Israel will move up in terms of Israel's hierarchy, in terms of China's hierarchy, because Iran is, like I said, weaker. China may not be able to depend so much on Iranian oil, and also the role of the United States might be shifting vis-a-vis Iran. So all of these things might mean that Israel would be a little bit more important. Still, I'm not sure if we're going back to the honeymoon days, but I think we will see a shift in that sense.
But if these rumors are true, and again, there's not been confirmation that the Chinese are selling J-10 fighter jets and other military equipment, advanced equipment to the Iranians, wouldn't the Israelis see that as precisely the kind of threat that they want to avoid? And wouldn't they then, either through the United States or directly with China, start confronting the Chinese to say, listen, you rearming Iran is impacting our national security, and therefore we're going to be very upset about that? If those rumors are true, again, I want to be very clear, we haven't seen any confirmation that the J-10s or other munitions have been going to Iran, but that's the buzz right now.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that kind of narrative, right? And you saw that narrative coming out of Beijing during the war, where if Iran had the J-10s, then it wouldn't have been as easy for Israel to attack, right? So, and now this is kind of a continuation of that narrative that came through the war. Listen, if it's true, if Iran is buying or will buy the Chinese jets, then that's something that Israel will have to come to terms with. But what kind of impact do you think Israel has on Chinese policy when it comes to arms sales to Iran? Not much.
Probably very little. Yeah, probably.
Very little. So in that sense, we're playing a game where you have limited influence, and how do you use it?
But what role do the United States have in terms of influencing Prime Minister Netanyahu's thinking on China? Obviously, the United States is a little bit schizophrenic right now because on the one hand, we've got Donald Trump pushing a very tough line on China with high tariffs, and at the same time, he wants to go to China with lots of CEOs. He wants a big deal. He's given TikTok a reprieve. So again, lots of mixed signals coming out of Washington on China specifically, but probably overseas, especially with an ally none closer than Israel is to the United States. They're saying, come on, work with us here to box out the Chinese. Netanyahu in the past has been good at pushing back on the Americans. Do you think that in terms of his political calculation, he will be willing to do that going forward?
I think he'll be much more hesitant to push back on this issue with the Americans. I think one of the things that became clear over the last few years and few months is Israel's dependence on the United States. And in that sense, if the Americans will come to the Israelis and say you have to limit your trade with China, for example, on technology, Israel would have little choice but to oblige. But like you said, we're seeing some flexibility in the American position. So if Donald Trump does go to Beijing with 100 CEOs, then maybe Israel can do business with China. And I'm sure some people in Israel will be looking for those flexibilities in due course.
Let's talk about the diplomacy on the ground. There's a relatively new Chinese ambassador in Israel, Xiao Junzheng. He's getting a lot of attention because apparently he's very outspoken. He's not the traditional Chinese ambassador who, is very, very conservative, sits behind the embassy walls, doesn't go out very much. Ambassador Xiao is speaking out in the media. He's very provocative in some respects. Seems like he's trying to change the direction of Sino-Israeli ties. What's your impression of Ambassador Xiao and in terms of what impact he might have on this relationship and where we are now?
So I haven't met the ambassador personally, but my impression from the media and from the narratives that are being released here into the public, he's on a charm offensive, right? He's trying to very much rebuild the relationship after the disappointment that the Israeli public felt following the 7th of October. I think he's being quite successful, actually, in the sense that there's openness to the narrative. There is an understanding, for example, if you need to rebuild the areas that were impacted by the war in recent weeks, who can do that, right? So China, for example, would be a candidate, or Chinese workers would be candidates to rebuild damaged cities, etc. Nevertheless, the question is, how significant a shift is this in terms of Beijing's strategic thinking? So just a few minutes ago, I said that I think Israel might be climbing again up the ladder, but it's all relative terms, right? I think when it comes down to it, Israel is still not very important, at least not bilaterally, in Chinese calculations. It becomes much more important when viewed through a regional lens. So when Israel becomes an operator or an actor on the regional stage, then China has more to offer and also more to lose, and Israel becomes much more important in the strategic calculations. And that's what might be shifting in the next few months moving ahead, both militarily. It's obvious that Israel has emerged again as a substantial regional military actor, and that's why we're seeing this warming up from Beijing, right? This need to kind of rebuild some of the bridges. And what we will see now with Trump pushing forward perhaps a regional Abraham Accords plus move, what would that mean for China? And would they want to reshape the relationship with Israel accordingly?
Yeah. I mean, one of the narratives that emerged in the United States, and I'm sure in Israel, because Israeli media and U.S. media tend to be very much in sync with one another, is that this war revealed how powerless China was to affect the outcome of the events on the ground. And so despite the fact that China, for quite some time, as you mentioned, wants to present itself as a mediator and a new major power in the region, at the end of the day, there was nothing that Beijing could do to impact the outcome either way in this conflict. And some people saw that as weakness, but I want to play a piece of sound that went viral from an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University, Oriana Schuyler Mastro. She wrote a book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, and she was speaking at a Council on Foreign Relations event while this conflict was going on, and she talked about the Chinese strategy, which had a slightly different take than this perception that China was weak. It's a little bit of a long soundbite, but I think it's worth it. And Gedaliah, I'd like to get your perspective on what Oriana said after.
So let me just say, when I think about the biggest influence of these events on the global order, I think about how we are all in this room talking about this. And there's one place where they are not spending their time, energy, and resources dealing with this, and that is in Beijing. Because while we have talked about for years how difficult it is to pivot to Asia, I will tell you, I've worked now, 14 years at the Pentagon, and obviously my views here are my own. I do not represent those of the United States Department of Defense, U.S. government, or the United States Air Force. But my first job, my boss said to me, just go into rooms and say, what about China? And that's all I did for years. And here we are in 2025. And I have to tell you, as someone who has worked on strategy and plans, and if I can toot my own horn, I've won 2 Officer of the Year awards for my ability to do strategy and plans. It's not that hard. Just do it. Just stop doing this other stuff and pivot towards Asia and focus on Asia. Right? So while we are sitting over here, I can tell you, I would love it if the United States could do everything. Like, let's go build that Golden Dome that's going to be useless, and let's go march in the streets of D.C. Let's do it all, but we do not have the resources, right? The United States spent more on its nuclear weapons than China spent on its whole military since 2006. And so while we sit in these defense circles and we pat ourselves on the back about how we won the Cold War because we convinced the Soviets to spend money and do stupid things, how can we then say in the same breath, maybe we should deploy troops again to the Middle East to fight this war? And so for me, we've run out of time. I've had policymakers say to me, Oriana, we're just going to do this. We're just going to do this first, and then we're going to do this. Meanwhile, China has been very strategically disciplined. They do not believe in foreign military intervention as a tool of power. They want to dominate Asia militarily, and we're going to talk about that on this panel. And a lot of people would consider me a China hawk because of my writings on that issue. But when it comes to the rest of the world, they're focused on using political and economic tools. Now, we might sit here and look at them and say, oh, that's not possible. Sure, wouldn't it be nice if you could protect your interests without sort of gunboat diplomacy? But the truth is they've done it successfully for 30 years. And, leaving judgment aside, the war in Afghanistan cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives. So which one is more impactful on the world? And so it's very difficult. The Chinese, they sit over there and they're just like, we want to stay out of it. Even with Iran, when you see people are talking about the autocratic quad of Iran and North Korea and Russia, and when I talk to the Chinese about it, they do not want that bloc because they understand they want to have their cake and eat it too. They have close relationships with those countries that give them strategic leverage. But their most important economic relationship is with Europe, right? The strategic relationship is with the United States. And so I have often tried to articulate recommendations to drag them into these things. And in a recent foreign affairs piece, I said when it came to Iran and others, we should start punishing China for the misbehavior of some of their friends. And when I talked to party officials about it, they read that article because everyone reads foreign affairs. And they said to me, Oriana, we hate this thing you wrote. And I said, but why? I said you didn't want this autocratic bloc. Isn't that nice? And they said, yeah, but you said we should suffer for how the Iranians and the North Koreans and the Russians behave. We don't like that, right? So the global order is going to be shaped by the fact that they're going to continue to compete efficiently and effectively moving forward while we continue to do 100 things at the same time. And that's how great powers decline.
So maybe that explains the way the Chinese behaved in this conflict by letting it sit back, let this play out. But at the end of the day, it's about economics and politics and not about getting too enmeshed in Israel, Iran, and all of these fights that are going on in your neighborhood.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And also in this context, what could China gain from getting more involved while the conflict is going on? Would it want to gamble on a weaker Iran? Would it want to find itself confronting the United States? Of course, it wouldn't. I think the strategy from a Chinese perspective would be to be very cautious, as we said, wait and see, and look for opportunities. And I agree too that China, especially in the Middle East, is offering an alternative narrative. Right. So one of the things we've seen over the last few months is the U.S. very much coming back as a military, as a security actor in the region, and China, as we're going to see, is going to be playing another role, a more economic role, despite what we said about the J-10s. But I think it's very much still valid that China is going to be coming to, and we talked about the Gulf as well. China is coming and offering an alternative model, not one that's based on military power, on changing the reality through force, but one that's based on economic cooperation. And that's why, by the way, I mentioned that if China really wants to play a role in the region, play a role in terms of mediation with Israel and the Palestinians, for example, but it could be also Israel and Iran, it could do so through its geoeconomic ticket, through advancing regional economic cooperation, because I think that's a realistic role and a realistic goal that China can advance if it was serious.
Well, let's assume that the ceasefire holds. Let's also assume that the status quo as it is today holds. That is, Lebanon stays the way it is and Hezbollah does not reappear or rearm. Let's assume that the Israelis have at least military control over Gaza and Hamas, and that there's some level of stability there. Again, the situation in Gaza is horrific beyond any imagination. But let's assume that in terms of war, that the situation generally is as it is today. Where does the Sino-Israeli relationship go, and what does it look like next year at this time?
Well, it's at the moment in the Middle East, it's hard to predict what will happen next week.
That's right.
And that's so it's a difficult question.
What's the trend line, though, in your view?
First of all, I hope that we'll see a ceasefire in Gaza soon. And if that happens, then some of the regional dynamic will change as well. For example, you could imagine a scenario where China, together with the Saudis or the Egyptians, play a role in reconstruction, right? For example, the port of Gaza. So you could see that kind of role. If if there is a push towards regional integration, right? There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of hype about that, but let's say that we're lucky and things move in a positive direction for once in the region. The question is, will China be a constructive player? Will China be part of it? Or will China be try to act as a spoiler in that sense, because it will be American-led, at least to start with. And I could see both things happening in terms of possibilities. The question is, what will China think to do? I think that if we want to hold China to its own words, that it wants to be a mediator, that it wants to be a constructive player, I think it will be smart for the Israelis to invite China to do something specific, reconstruction in Gaza, for example, I think could be a good one, or in Lebanon, or do something on the economic side to help regional stability.
And you don't think the Americans would intervene to block that? I can see the argument on Fox News saying they opposed everything and now they're profiting from it.
I think some in the American administration will definitely oppose it. But on the other hand, there will be other interests at hand, and also it won't be direct. I don't think that China itself will come and say, we're going to come and rebuild Gaza, right? They won't. They won't take that kind of risk. They won't put that kind of money. But I can imagine, for example, an Egyptian-Saudi project that involves a Chinese infrastructure company involving the port. And I think that's quite realistic, and I think that's something that will be done with oversight from Beijing, and that could be done not only in Israel, but in other neighborhoods. You see, you have a lot of hype at the moment about Israel-Syria relationship, the potential for Israel-Syria relationship in Lebanon. You could see regional projects where China plays a role. Will it cause tension with the United States? Absolutely. I think that's a default. The question is whether you can find frameworks that could make that work. But I think, generally speaking, as the theme of our conversation today goes, I think China will be quite cautious. I think Israel is not very important for China in that sense. But I think if it sees an opportunity to position itself where there's a vacuum, I think they will try. And we're seeing them being more active on the Israeli front, as you said, in recent months.
I think being more active is probably the safest forecast that we can put forward today. And as you said, it's always a risky proposition to predict anything that's going to happen 1 year, much less one day in the Middle East. Gedaliah, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights with us. We always learn so much when you're with us. Gedaliah Afterman is the head of the Asia-Israel Policy Program at the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations, and a lecturer at Reichman University and Tel Aviv University. So once again, Gedaliah, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
And then Cobus will be back with me next week, back to usual. And of course, if you want to follow all the great work that Cobus and the team are doing, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And of course, your subscriptions help to support the work that we do in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So for Cobus Van Staden, who's off on assignment for us today, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Thank you for watching and for listening.